Welcome to the Cities at Tufts colloquium. Along with our partners Shareable and the Kresge Foundation, we offer a interesting set of talks on a range of topics that are really pressing in the world today. I'm Professor Julian Adgerman, together with my research assistants Perry Scheinbaum and Caitlin McLennan. We organise Cities at Tufts as a cross-disciplinary academic initiative which recognises Tufts University as a leader in urban studies, urban planning and sustainability issues. We'd like to acknowledge that Tufts University's Medford campus is located on colonised Wampanoag and Massachusetts traditional territory. Today, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Jessica Omukuti. Jessica's research expertise is on climate justice and equity, climate finance, climate change and adaptation, and just transitions in the Global South. Jessica is a research fellow on inclusive net zero for the Oxford Net Zero initiative and is based at Oxford University's Institute of Science, Innovation and Technology. Her work involves engaging with actors in the Global South to outline what net zero means and how inclusivity can be embedded into net zero policies and practices in the Global South. Jessica is also an ESRC COP26 fellow based at the University of York in England, and her research focuses, as I said, on the delivery of climate finance for adaptation to climate change, specifically using the Green Climate Fund as a case study. And Jessica's talk today is Climate Action in the Global South. Is net zero sufficiently inclusive? Jessica, a Zoom-tastic welcome to the Cities at Tufts colloquium. Thank you.
Thanks, Julian. Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here. I have been really looking forward to speaking with you today, and so I'm hoping that we can have a conversation. So today's conversation will be about climate justice and climate action in the Global South. And as Julian mentioned, I'll base this conversation on my current and previous work on climate finance, but also on net zero. And so I'll just start off by introducing myself. I will take the next about half hour. Let me just start my timer. I'll take about the next half hour. I'm just going through some of the issues that I think are quite important to understand when you're thinking about climate action in the Global South. And then we'll use the last maybe 20 or so minutes for Q&A. And so yeah, please feel free to just ask me the basic questions, and most of the, if you think you have a very complex question, please do. I'm happy to answer it. And so just a bit about myself. So I, let me see. Oh, it's working now. Okay, so I am a research fellow at the University of Oxford. And my work is focused on net zero in the Global South. And so I am interested, or my part of the project is interested in understanding whether net zero can be inclusive and how we can make that happen, particularly for the Global South, but also in the Global South. And most people ask me, what do you mean by the Global South? I think in this case, we'll just have a very, very specific definition. It's countries in Africa. It's kind of very, very geographical. So it's countries in Africa, Latin America, and in parts of Asia, and so that's mostly South Asia. And so for the whole Oxford Net Zero program is interested in obviously understanding net zero as a framework for climate action. And as I mentioned, my component is just understanding how do we make net zero inclusive for the Global South, but also in the Global South. And I'll talk about that a bit later. Before joining the University of Oxford, I worked at the University of York at the IGDC, Interdisciplinary Global Development Center, but I've worked at other places. And so I spent some time working for the Green Climate Fund, which is a very big, famous, favorite, dedicated climate finance institution. I've also worked in development organizations such as Mercyco. I've worked with CARE. I started off working at the Global Climate Adaptation Partnership way many years ago. But I've also worked with CHOOOSE, which is a carbon offset, kind of really not carbon, but an emission offset institution or company. It's a kind of a private sector company that deals with carbon offsets. And I'm Kenyan, if you're wondering. I grew up in a very very agricultural-based area in Kenya, and I was trained as a meteorologist at the University of Nairobi, and then I did an MSc at the University of Sussex in the UK, and then did a PhD at the University of Reading. And so my work started off as a climate scientist, but I've progressed, I've kind of built up on that to finally start doing climate justice. But then in between that, I've done a bit of climate information services, and then I progressed to doing some work on resilience and adaptation in sub-Saharan Africa, and then that has finally transformed into climate finance and climate justice, and now net zero. And so my main interests are, as obviously, as you can see, it's on climate change and adaptation and resilience, and how that intersects with climate justice and equity, but also seeing how that plays out in relation to climate finance. And then lastly, I've added in net zero in the global south. And so kind of the interaction between that, how does climate finance affect net zero, but also how does net zero affect climate finance? And then in the middle is where we get everything that's interesting and fun happening. So I'll just start off. Julian told me about this year's class, and he said that you've been talking about climate change, and so me explaining that climate change is everyone's reality, but more for some than for others, is something that you probably already know. There's obviously the global shift, the very binary division in causation and impacts of climate change, or the consequences of climate change. But even within those regions, for example, in Africa, we have places that are better able to respond to climate change than others. But also within Africa, there's people who have contributed more emissions, who have emitted more emissions than others. In the UK, it's still the same. You can see differences in contribution to climate change, but also differences in ability to respond to the impacts of climate change. But then within these, I think the most recent IPCC report was able to show that we're still experiencing very, very extreme effects at the moment, and these are definitely going to get worse as we move, for example, as we move into the second part of this century. And we find that some places, for example, in North Africa, we'll find that the central parts of Latin America will have very, very quicker warming as compared to other places. We'll have coastal areas, being affected much more than inland areas. And so we have different types of climate risks for different people, and some people will be much more affected by a combination of climate change risks. And that is why we start off by thinking about how do we define climate action. And my concern is, well, there's obviously global climate action where we're thinking about how much do we need to do to limit emissions, but also what can we do in the global south. But so it's thinking about what should we be doing in the global south, or what should the global south be doing, and then going further and asking what can the global south do. And so I'll just be very presumptuous here and assume that most of you don't know about the Paris Agreement. And so I'll just step back a bit and give a very basic introduction to the Paris Agreement. And so it is it is an international agreement for countries and actors to resolve or to address climate change. And there's Article 4.1 in the Paris Agreement is what I consider a very important first step to addressing climate change, specifically in the framework of limiting emissions, but also supporting adaptation. And so Article 4.1 says that for us to address climate change, we need to aim to reach global peaking of greenhouse gases as soon as possible. Of interest here is as soon as possible. And so the Paris Agreement, which was I think, what's the right word? Let's use created, which was created in 2015, said back then, it said that we need to peak as soon as possible. And then in the same line, it says that we recognize that peaking will take longer for developing countries. And then after saying that, but it says that we need to undertake very rapid reductions thereafter, in accordance with best available science. And we need to achieve a balance between anthropogenic emissions by sources and removals by sinks of greenhouse gases in the second half of the century. And so it says that we need to peak very soon, yeah? It says that some people will take longer than others to do the peaking, but we also need to start reducing our emissions very, very quickly. And it says that we need to balance between how much we emit and how much we reduce by sources and by removals, and using removals by sinks. And then there's a last bit to it. It says that we should do this on the basis of equity and in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty. And so there's kind of a lot of things playing out here. So it's kind of the timelines where it's as soon as possible by mid-century. There's issues such as some people will do this better, or some people will take a bit longer to do it. It's kind of recognizing that there's an issue of equity, but also countries still need to do this in the context of sustainable development and poverty eradication. And this is what we're using to define climate action moving forward. And in essence, this is what we're using to say that limiting warming, we will need to balance between emissions and sinks, and that is net zero. So kind of net zero is where we say that emissions will need, what we emit into the atmosphere, anthropogenic emissions, will need to be counterbalanced, and so counterbalanced by what we capture back from the atmosphere. And that is the basis of net zero. But this is kind of in relation to the science. And so the science says that for us to limit warming to 2 degrees, we need to capture X amount of carbon from the atmosphere, or we need to limit the amount of carbon in the atmosphere by this much gigatons, or we need to reduce this much gigatons per year until this much time. And so there's the science that underlies this. And here's what the science says. The science says that if we continue business as usual, we will obviously have a continual increase in temperatures. But then for us to reach net zero, which is very much implied in the Paris Agreement, we'll have to reduce how much we emit. And that's the blue zone. Let me see if I can pause this. We'll need to reduce how much we emit, but also we'll have to balance that with removals through sinks. And the blue line, as you can see, the blue line kind of shows when we reach net zero. And so net zero, if we use this graph that was developed by WRI, we are more likely to reach a net zero emissions by around that's about 2065. And that's why we're still emitting a bit of carbon, but also we're kind of countering that with a lot of carbon removal from the atmosphere. And so net zero is kind of a science. So net zero says that we need to do this. The science says that we need to limit, we need to limit the amount of carbon we put into the atmosphere by this much gigatons of carbon. But also net zero is a framework that tells us how to do that. And so it says that we have to combine carbon, limiting how much we emit. So that is carbon avoidance or emission avoidance with emission removals. And as a framework, it's really, really important because, it's quite important, but it's also quite broad because there's little guidance on how we do it. I mean, if you go back to the Paris Agreement, it just says, well, let's do it by the second half of the century. And then it says by that, well, some people will have to do it, later than others. And the Paris Agreement also says, oh yeah, some people will have to take up a bit more responsibility for it, to let others do it. And we have to do that within sustainable development and poverty reduction. And so it's a very broad framework. And that is a good thing because there's very different needs in the world. There's very different needs within continents, across continents. People need to determine their own priorities. But then it's also quite tricky because, and it's also quite tricky because a lot could go wrong. And a lot could go wrong because it's kind of a very blank slate. Well, not really extremely blank because we kind of have that goal of we need to limit warming by 2 degrees, and to do that we have to achieve net zero. But then countries have been asked to make pledges for emission reductions towards net zero. But then, and for those who are new to this, there's been a lot of re-pledging, renewals of ambitions through the nationally determined contributions. And the UNFCCC did an assessment. So 20 countries were supposed to submit new revised pledges that showed new ambitions for contribution towards emission reductions. And the NDCs that were submitted last year, they showed that whatever ambition that countries were saying they would do was just not enough. And so pledges are growing, have much more participation, much more willingness for people to make pledges towards net zero. And it's just not countries. We have businesses, we have institutions, we have even cities making pledges towards net zero. But the ambition does not really, it's not enough to even reach net zero by, within the time frame that we're hoping for. But then there's the climate action tracker that has tried to assess what these ambitions, the low ambition that we're saying versus pledges and what we need to do, and finds that with the current policies, we will get a 2.7 to 3.1 degree warming, mean warming. But then with the pledges and targets that countries are submitting, and just the countries and businesses and cities and whatever everyone is submitting, will probably land at 2.6 degrees. And if some of you read there's the IPCC 1.5 special report that said that warming of 2 degrees is dangerous. That will mean that we have biodiversity losses, we have a lot of sea level rise that is very, very catastrophic for a lot of things. In fact, we'll have some things just going extinct. And so just think about, if we stick to the current pledges, we'll have a 2.6 degree Celsius warming, which is way, way more than what we can even imagine. But then even an optimistic net zero target will get us to 2.1, which is just even worse. And so to get a 2 degree consistent warming, countries will have to reduce a lot of their emissions. And I usually kind of think about how much we need to do in relation to what happened in March of last year when we had a lockdown. So I was in the UK, and in March it was a really uncertain time, but I remember things shut down very, very quickly. People weren't going to the supermarkets. There was just deliveries being done, no going to school, no going to work. And so there was a very, very huge economic slowdown. But even then, we did not achieve the rate of reduction in emissions that we even need annually to reach a 2 degree consistent, to reach a 2 degree consistent warming. And so that means that to get to net zero, we'll have to transform our economies, how we produce, very, very drastically. And it excites some people. It scares quite a lot, even more people, because that level of transformation is unheard of. We will need to think about new ways to go to school, about new ways of seeing our families overseas, which gives us very little time. We're kind of in 2020, and that's given us about 70 years or even less to do that. And that technological transformation is still unknown. Anyway, moving on. But then there's a group that is thinking, well, we're definitely not on the path to net zero. And if we get to net zero, it will be at a much later date, towards probably the end, the last bit of the second half of the century. But then they say that hitting net zero is not enough, really. We must restore the climate. And so there's one group of people that are saying that, well, we're making pledges, but they're not enough. And there's another very radical group of people that are saying that, well, we don't need net zero. We need absolute zero emissions for us to be able to survive this planet, for us to keep the planet as it's supposed to be. And so some people are urging governments to very drastically cut greenhouse gas emissions. And so think about it. If net zero is that difficult to achieve, how will cutting greenhouse gas emissions absolutely, how will it look like? Anyway, and then there's this kind of beyond that, that's kind of the very broad discussion. And then there's a group of people that are saying, what exactly is net zero? And so what sort of transformations will we need? What sort of actions will we need? And what does that mean for the global South? Because at the international level, the global South is this very, very politically, powerless group that is only is at the mercy of very global politics that is controlled by the global North. And so the global South, in most discussions of net zero, I was part of a climate neutrality forum. I attended a climate neutrality forum at the University of Oxford, and we had so many people attending. We had 3 hubs in person, but then there was a lot of people attending online who were talking about what do we need to achieve climate neutrality. And most of the discussions were talking about, we need policies, we need technology, we need action in America, in North America specifically, and in Europe. And I think there was very few people mentioning about, what could happen in the global South, but it was just, those one-off mentions about, the global South is seen as a very silent participant in this case, or a very reactive participant in net zero. And so its job is to either follow the leader, or A or B, to be able to implement policies that are created in the global north. For example, a lot of these conversations kind of assume that there will be a very huge machine that will be created in the UK, and that will be taken to a small country, let's say a small country like Zimbabwe, and it will be placed there, and it will absorb all the carbon from the atmosphere, and then we will achieve net zero. And so global South countries are seen as, supporters of global North policies and global North ambitions, but not as agents of determining what net zero should look like. But then one of my colleagues, Lavanya, and her other colleagues, said that developing countries need to chart their own course to net zero emissions, where they decide what they should do and how they should do it and when they should do it. Because these countries have made very little contribution towards climate change, but also they're affected much more than that. And if you go back to the Paris Agreement, it says that we should limit emissions within the framework of sustainable development, which is a very huge priority for countries in the global South, but also within the framework of poverty reduction, but not even just reduction, eradication of poverty. And then in a way, kind of the Paris Agreement says that, well, you can only start considering net zero after you've achieved sustainable development, and after probably, or you're closer to eradicating poverty. But then there's work that says that thinking about net zero, specifically in relation to the global South, should have an approach that incorporates fair share, where fair share could be either responsibility for emissions, or capacity to implement net zero policies and strategies. And so it's where we say that developing countries will chart their own course based on fair share, where they say that we either we don't have the capacity to do this, and so we will develop our capacity, or we will attend to our most urgent priorities. And then when we're able to, and in accordance with the Paris Agreement, we will pick our emissions a bit later and then start reducing them in line with the science. But then the problem is that even with the Paris Agreement, there's still a lot of push for countries in the global South to start reducing their emissions. And as you remember, the UN assessment of the NDCs, some of the NDCs that were submitted were from developing countries. Some of the NDCs were from developed countries. And so the assessment in overall found that there were very few, there's very limited ambition to achieve the Paris Agreement 2.0 degree temperature target. But then there's kind of a very strong push at the moment for countries in the global South to start limiting the emissions. A very good example is last week. Yes, last week. I kind of lose. Last week there was the what's it called? The Green Climate Fund that I mentioned earlier. So the Green Climate Fund had its 30th board meeting, and they were supposed to re-accredit a South African Development Bank. It's called the DBSA, Development Bank for South Africa. It operates in the Southern Africa region. And before re-accreditation, so accreditation basically is where institutions are kind of in a way vetted to see whether they are aligned with the goals of the Green Climate Fund and whether they can manage GCF funds. And so usually you get accreditation, and then you kind of get that passport for about 5 years, and then you have to come back again and tell them, well, I'm still the same person, or I'm a better person, and so give me permission to still work with you. And so DBSA was seeking the accreditation, and the board of the GCF, part of the board, so the board of the GCF is made up of 24 members, 12 from developed countries and 12 from developing countries. And so the developed country faction, part of it, was of the opinion that before DBSA is re-accredited, it should show commitment to achieving, to being in alignment with net zero by 2050. And that basically meant that the DBSA should make a commitment to not fund fossil fuels, or not to put its money in fossil fuels. But this kind of was a very, very big thing, because developing countries do not want those conditionalities. And I was having a conversation with my colleagues yesterday. It kind of, we thought that the conflict between developing country members at the board and developed countries is basically seen as, it's seen as if net zero is being weaponized to force developing countries onto a certain path that is not in alignment with the clause that I showed you in the Paris Agreement. And so we had this very important tweet by Zahir Fakir. So he is a South African government representative, and he said that following the GCF B30 board meeting, it is absolutely disgusting to see how some developed countries are using the GCF and the needs of developing countries to impose their unilateral will and conditions on them. And so it's kind of the weaponizing of net zero against the global South. When some experts, practitioners think that developing countries should chart their own discourse. And there was a bit of a back and forth, but then that shows where net zero is going. That shows that there's the kind of the risk of weaponization. There's also the kind of the tendency of mistrust from the global South, where they suspect that developed countries will start using it. And when you think about this, you kind of see the conditionality that part of the board put on DBSA is kind of very similar to what we've seen with the structural adjustment programs by the World Bank earlier, but it's also some of the conditionalities we've seen and up to the early 2000s or even the 2010s, where you have to do this before we give you the money. You have to achieve this, you have to implement this before you're able to do that. And so it's kind of, it's inclusivity, where we think about what is net zero, what should net zero be, but also what should net zero be for the global South, and how can the global South be able to chart their own discourse? But then should they also be able to do that? Is it a right? Is it something that should be dictated by someone else? And who's that someone else? Who gives them that opportunity to do that? So that's my work now. I think about what is net zero in the global South, and at the moment I'm thinking about it in three aspects and kind of three lenses. I'll have a good idea about the right word in a few months. And so it's kind of in three ways. It's inclusivity for net zero is equity and justice in net zero. Inclusivity is ensuring that there's equitable processes and outcomes, but there's also justice in how net zero is defined and implemented. And it's kind of justice and equity for the global South in international net zero. And where we say that international net zero is how we define how the world should achieve net zero. And usually, as I mentioned, net zero discussions kind of overlook the global South. At the moment, I suspect that the global South is the global South is somewhere. We need to know where the global South is in relation to understanding of net zero, but also what they could do, what they're willing to do in relation to other priorities. And so we need to kind of have justice and equity for the global South within international debates, but also inclusivity is justice and equity in the global South within those countries and within those regions. There needs to be an understanding of how net zero is defined, how they think they'll achieve net zero, and specifically looking at what sectors need to decarbonize, which sectors need to decarbonize a bit later, which areas, which places, which communities are more affected by net zero, which ones are not affected. And then the third component to an inclusivity net zero is thinking about future generations in the global South, which is really interesting because when we talk about future generations, mostly we think about future generations in the global North. And the kind of shifting this conversation to the global South is very, very important because we have the greatest proportion of youth is in the global South. Population growth will happen in the global South, and we'll still have this very young population coming up. And this is where we start thinking about what does just transitions, how does a transition towards net zero mean for people who will be born 10 years from now, about 30 years from now. And so within this are three or four research areas that I'm kind of thinking about. One is, what is net zero in the global South? If you go back to the DBSA example, obviously DBSA and Zahir have a different idea about what net zero is. There's an article the article that I showed, there's the links in the PowerPoint, you can have a look at that. There was kind of a pushback where developing country board members were saying that, well, DBSA has committed to doing this, but then developed countries were thinking they were thinking that that is not enough. We need we need stronger commitments towards not funding coal power plants or fossil fuels, or not investing in new fossil fuel sources. And so we need to understand what net zero means in the global south. And this is also particularly important because countries in the global south have been doing different forms of net zero. And so there's, growing up and even in my early career, I'd hear things about low carbon development, low emission development. There used to be mainstreaming of climate change into development. There's things such as very specific tools and strategies such as REDD+, which are kind of a very important component to net zero, or maybe part of net zero or entirely not net zero. And so we need to know where the global south is in relation to net zero. They may have done something, they may not have done something. And so it's understanding what net zero means in the global south, and then using that to build up to kind of, create an understanding, kind of create a shared understanding of what they can do. And then linked to that is how can countries and actors in the global south reach net zero. And so this is very, very practical, and that's kind of in the framework of sustainable development, because countries still need to develop, institutions still need to develop, and looking at what role can actors play to help these places reach net zero. And important to that is, what does just transition look like within a global south context? And this is quite important also for me because I started working on just transitions about 3-4 years ago. And one of the things I realized is discussions on that mostly focus on the global north. There's a lot of literature on how Germany can transition to net zero, or the US about coal-dependent communities living around coal mines. But there's very limited information about how Nepal can transition to net zero, how countries that are not really as dependent on fossil fuels as the global north, but whose dependence on fossil fuels is kind of means a very, very, very huge lifeline. It means either you stop developing or you develop. And so it's kind of a very good example. I was speaking with my colleagues yesterday who were saying that not investing in a new coal power plant could be significant for, it could mean nothing if let's say, if a country such as the US says that we're not investing in new coal power plants, that means something different as compared to a country such as Tanzania, which probably has 2 coal power plants, and will say that we will either not invest in new coal power plants, or we will kind of take them off operation. If your infrastructure is 50% of what you have, if fossil fuels is 50% of your infrastructure, then that has a very huge implication for how you transition to a net zero status. And so we need to understand what just transitions mean in the global south. And then lastly is barriers and enablers for net zero in the global south. And so this is kind of a very overall assessment about what are the barriers in different regions, different countries, different sectors, and different communities. What is the role of cities? What is the role of communities? What role can businesses play? And that's something that people have actually overlooked. And that's something I'm really looking forward to kind of going deeper and looking at what role can businesses play in the global south in enabling or supporting or identifying net zero targets. Okay, lastly, my last slide here is, so my work is on inclusivity net zero, and I work as part of a larger team. Oxford Net Zero was funded by the Strategic Research Fund for the university, so it's kind of an internal investment. And we collaborate. We have different departments, different schools collaborating. And right now, as you can see, I'm part of a group from this. So there's people who are working on the law and governance of net zero and law and governance of emissions. And then there's people who are working on greenhouse gas removals, where they think about geological storage, the role of oceans, the role of nature-based solutions. We're thinking about how we can bring in people from behavioral sciences and psychology, how we can engage with philosophers to kind of understand the framework of net zero, not just the science itself, but also the framework of net zero. And so the team is growing. We're trying to kind of cover as much space as we can. And so it's a lot of collaboration, but then inclusivity kind of cuts across that. Inclusivity is part of the removals when you think about nature-based solutions, about what's the role of offsets, what is the role of forests or parks or wetland, but also storage, and and what is the law and governance of net zero, and inclusivity also cuts through that. And so, I think that's it. Links are in the slides, and I will share them, hopefully. And if you're interested in any of the things that I mentioned, please do reach out. I'd be really happy to speak to you. And I don't know how long I took. That's about 32 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jessica. That was a really fantastic overview of your work, and some really provocative questions that the chat is evidence that people really want to speak to you about these things. So I'm just going to jump straight in, Jessica. Steph asks, I would like to know your thoughts on the Green New Deal and how the Global South often gets the short end of the stick with this type of extractive capitalism.
So mostly, the Green New Deal, obviously, it started off in obviously the North, but Africa is jumping on it. It took a while for, let's just use Africa as an example. African countries are jumping on it. We can see a bit of agency emerging from discussions on what a Green New Deal could mean for the Global South. It is taken a while. It is because obviously there's the international push for these countries to commit towards very specific aspects of the Green New Deal. But then I think the African Union has some form of New Deal, a green deal, and what interests me the most is the capacity of the willingness of countries to engage on these issues. It's also the willingness of different other sets of actors within the continent. And so at the moment, we're thinking about what can countries in the Global South do to transition to a Green New Deal. And so there's very, very, very specific requirements where we know that you need to decarbonize these sectors, you need to provide protection for these areas, you need to anticipate these changes. But then how to do that is something I think most countries are still struggling with. But the most important thing is how to finance it, how to resource it. And that's, I think, the biggest gap, where there's very significant finance gaps. Finance is the biggest issue, because we know there's the 3 pillars of the Paris Agreement. So there's the finance bit, there's technology, and there's capacity. And once you have finance sorted, it's easier to kind of start thinking about how do we address technology needs and how do we address capacity needs. And so most of these areas are thinking about how do we get the finance to achieve this Green New Deal. I hope that answers your question.
Great, thank you. I mean, one thing strikes me, and this isn't particularly my area of expertise, but I think about it from, everything that you've talked about in many ways is about the economics, the technical know-how, the science, but there's a huge moral morass here, isn't there? These people in the DBSA, in South Africa, these people around the world who are being first and worst affected are the least responsible and the least able to do something about it. That's a moral problem. And then to hear words like, that the Green Climate Fund is bullying or coercing, that just, surely global capitalism can grow some moral backbone. What do you think, Jessica?
Well, it should, but it won't. I've been working, this is just a very good example. I've been working with a group called the Scotia Group. They're a group of very influential leaders who are trying to kind of make a statement about what should happen at COP26. And so I'm part of a mediation support unit. We're supporting the Scotia Group to provide recommendation for very specific areas. And one of them is loss and damage. And I'm working on the loss and damage group. And so we started off by asking, we started off by recognizing that loss and damage has been a very, very slow topic to kind of progress at COPs. All they do is identify very procedural issues and saying that we will develop this working group and then we will agree on this, but not really substantial decisions. And so we asked ourselves, how do we unlock negotiations at the COP? And we started off by asking, should we go with the responsibility bit, where we say that because a group of countries caused this, they should be responsible for addressing loss and damages. And then we thought about it and like, nah, it will never work, because responsibility, historical responsibility, has been on the table since the Earth Summit in the 1992 meeting, but it hasn't gone anywhere because the pushback against responsibility has been so strong. And that's why you see researchers and practitioners recommending other soft measures for achieving equity, where it's not like, yeah, let's put away historical responsibility. We know that we've done this, but we're not willing to admit that. And so let's just go with the capacity, where we say that it doesn't matter whether you contributed to it. What matters is, can you do it? And so our recommendations for loss and damage are kind of very soft, approachy. We say that addressing loss and damage at the COP will need you to kind of get some solidarity from different people, where you're not accusatory, where you're just like, please support us, we really need this. And that's where climate action is going, or global discussions on climate action are going, where it's just, yeah, it's moving away from that responsibility bit. And it's really worrying, because it means that we won't get the action that we need. It won't happen as fast as it's needed. We will have so many losses by the time we even get close to addressing climate change, if we ever do.
Great, okay. So Johnny Shively has a question. I've heard arguments that carbon emissions are significantly higher in the global north than the global south. Is focusing on the global south a distraction from reducing emissions where the majority of production, extraction and carbon emissions are centered?
It is. It's a political game. It's a whataboutism. I heard that through something on Twitter. It's kind of asking, yeah, it's saying that, yeah, we're doing this, and we've emitted X carbon over the last 10 years. And what about those guys? They've emitted X plus 20 tons of carbon over the last 10 years. And that it's saying that irrespective of historical contribution, we need to reduce emissions in the global south. And that is, and as I mentioned, that overlooks capacity, but it's also used as a political tool to control control actions in the global south. As I mentioned, so financing is financing is given on the condition that countries have made commitments to net zero. Funding towards very specific areas is being cut, because it's assumed, or it's thought as being a very huge contributor to emissions. And so in a way, and this is my biggest worry at the moment, it's something that I'm just thinking about, is how bad could this go? How far can net zero go? How worse could it get? And what are the scenarios? In a very good world, we'd have people doing their fair share, countries, institutions doing their fair share. In a very different world, in a very different scenario, we could have, those who have the greatest burden still doing the greatest, bearing the greatest responsibility. And it's not even just about responsibility for emissions; it's responsibility for not acting. So we could ask the global south to pay for this in other forms, and so it's either paying for through money, but also paying through debt. We could also ask them to pay through lives, and a lot of the lives we've seen lost. I mean, what is the price of science? The price of science is having lives lost and having CNN going over there and saying, oh, well, okay, yeah, they died, and that's sea level rise. And so what is the price of action? And most of these prices are paid in the global south in ways that cannot really be quantified through monetary terms, and that's where loss and damage comes in. And as I said, loss and damage at the COP has been really, really difficult to address. It's really slow, and yeah, I hope something changes. I'm really very hopeful on the next COP. COP27 is happening in Africa. We'll have it in Egypt. And we're kind of trying to align ourselves to be in the path of that COP so that we can start steering conversations towards more equitable and inclusive net zero, but also towards discussions of loss and damage. It may not come to anything, but then it's just hoping.
Just a quick follow on to that, and I don't want to monopolize the questions here, Jessica, but just something that's just really burning me at the moment. We're talking a lot about reparations here in the US, and 20 years ago, if you'd asked me, that would have meant writing a check. Now I realize reparations is about the restoration of the full capabilities of humans to achieve their full potential. That's what reparations are to me. To what extent is the language, the narrative of reparations being used by global southern nations in terms of this reduced capacity for humans to live full and happy lives? Are you using the notion of any form of reparations for climate debt, for instance?
You'd see reparations coming up quite a lot in discussions for on losses and damages from climate change, but also reparations, and so it's kind of a lot of the discussions I've seen are discussed in the context of should we be even asking about reparations? It's not even about what reparations, and so we're really far off from even getting there. And so, for example, in the discussion on loss and damage. One of our reviewers said that, don't even mention reparations, although we hadn't mentioned it, there was nothing about reparations because we recognize that talking about reparations is responsibility, and responsibility is something that will never be discussed. But then in a review, someone just went out and said, well, don't mention reparations. And so discussions are really quite far off. In academia, we've gone further and talked about, what exactly does reparations mean? But then in policy, it's kind of very far off of a question of, why are we even thinking about it, and are there alternative ways to go around this other than reparation? And so the question is quite political. It has political implications for both the global north and the global south. I have one of my friends, one of my colleagues at the University of Reading, who was looking at loss and damage, and whether loss and damage can be seen as adaptation. And I remember one thing that she mentioned. I think she's probably finalizing her thesis. And one of the things she did her thesis in the Maldives. She based her thesis on the Maldives, and she spoke to communities that were being displaced from sea level rise. And one thing she mentioned that has stuck with me since is that people in the Maldives don't want the big money. They just want someone to come over and say and admit that they did something wrong, and say that, we're sorry, we did this and we're sorry, and we recognize that you've lost a lot. And so reparations are, it's a contextual meaning. And so, and in policy circles, we're really far off from that.
Yeah, great. Okay, thanks. But I think it's one to keep an eye on. I think this certainly, in the US, it's a very big question, and I think it's one to think about. We have a question from Lamia. Hi, Jessica. I was wondering how the Paris Agreement, the Sendai framework, and the SDGs are working in synergy. Is there a common framework that connects them? Great question, Lamia.
I don't think there is, and maybe I don't know, maybe they exist, but thing is, I worry about this, but with imposter syndrome in academia, sometimes you just don't trust yourself. But I worry that we're creating too many frameworks. And these frameworks are kind of addressing, there's so many overlaps between them, but then we expect institutions, actors, we expect countries to, fit into all these frameworks and to create plans for them, strategize for them, and implement them. But then the Paris Agreement, by mentioning that we have to do this in the framework of sustainable development and poverty reduction, in a way brings in the SDGs and brings in the Sendai framework. And so most of these plans, countries are usually, or even institutions are usually encouraged to think about them in relation to their other priorities, in relation to their other commitments. And so it's kind of and when you see support given to these countries, it's kind of, we're supporting you to think in a holistic way. How that happens in practice is a different case. But then, yeah, there's obviously the frameworks, there's encouragement, there's obviously teams that are working to make sure that they are connected. But in most cases, you'll still see them being discussed separately. And so I don't think even that's an answer to your question. It's probably much more confusing than that. But yeah, that's it.
Okay, Emily Wood has a question. I'm curious if there are recommendations for changes in how these COPs and other avenues where global pledges are discussed are run. Are these avenues that can lead to changes in how we focus on the global south and net zero?
I don't know. I cannot speak for the global south. I think the global south is countries, but also it's more than the countries. It is the cities, it's the municipalities, it's also the communities. I think COPs are really important. COPs are an opportunity for mostly countries, which are the parties, to come on and express their needs in an equal platform, an assumed equal platform, and to have negotiations and agree on what could be done. But then obviously COP represents policies, not actions, because we've seen policies agreed on at the COP and then they just never come to fruition. For example, we had the Kyoto Protocol, which turned out terrible, and then we've had so many, like the 100 billion climate finance at Copenhagen, which has not been done. And so the COP is an opportunity to start these discussions. And what feeds into the COP are years and years of work. For example, we have work by the IPCC, we have work being done by community-based organizations, NGOs, we have trade unions that feed into that. And so the COP is just kind of the peak of how these things work. Underneath it is what counts as, what makes these processes quite meaningful. And so if we were to try to kind of, if I were given an opportunity to kind of make the COP much more effective, I would I would think about what happens at Glasgow in a few weeks, but I also think about what feeds into this. Do we have processes that ensure that that single person in that very remote place in, let's say in Malaysia, has, knows that, there's decisions that are being made that will determine their lives for the rest, the rest of their lives, but also they're able to feed into those processes. Do we have much more bottom-up processes, or is the COP just a top-down process? And so, yeah, a very short answer to your question. The COP can be a very good platform, but there's work that has shown that it's, historically it's just been unequal. For example, developing countries do not have equal representation. They have very limited capacity. They come in with less, a smaller delegation. Like this year, a lot of developing countries will not, they won't even be able to attend because of COVID restrictions. There's historical issues that affect participation, representation, and meaningful engagement at the COP. But then even beyond that, what happens at lower than the international level is quite important. I hope that answers your question.
Great, thanks, Jessica. Two quick questions, well, hopefully two quick questions. Vladimir asks, what coordinated action across public and private sectors do you feel would be most helpful in making meaningful progress?
This is just a very biased opinion, actually, because I work on climate finance, but we need resources to finance climate change. Net zero will not happen without the money. Just transitioning an energy system in a small community requires a lot of money, because communities just don't even have energy in most global south countries, and then getting them into renewable energy and then taking them further to kind of make that energy continuously available in sufficient quantities at the right time is really challenging. And so at the center of net zero, but also at the center of climate action, which goes beyond net zero, because I think that, well, we're looking at achieving net zero by 2065 or 2050. And I think we need to kind of put in place strategies that will either keep it that way or we'll be able to keep taking it down. Because if we think in the short term, then we'll get to net zero by 2065, or we'll get there by 2100. And then we'll be there for about 5 years, and then just things will start going back up again. And then people are like, okay, so we didn't plan for this. And so we need money to get to net zero and either keep it that way or keep taking the emissions down. And the money is at the moment, it's not there. There's very little commitment. Developed countries said that they would provide finance for climate change, but they haven't. Whatever they're providing is quite conditional, as you see in the case of the GCF. Whatever they're providing is not working. And so a lot of money has been spent on adaptation that does not reduce vulnerability. And so if you look at funding for the last 20 or 30 years, you say that this money could have done much more than what it's done so at the moment. And so it kind of just, you see money going through water projects every year, and you're wondering why are we still doing this? We should be learning. If it's not working, let's try a different approach that should give us better results in terms of vulnerability reduction. And so getting more climate action is, for me, and other people will say will give different opinions. For example, other people will say we need reparations. I'm not a reparation expert. I'm a climate finance expert. And so at the center of it is climate finance. In the right quantities, at the right time, but also much more effective. It should reduce vulnerability.
And are there moves towards correcting climate finance and leveling the playing field? What are those efforts, Jessica?
What do you mean?
Well, you've said that the playing field is not level at the moment, and that climate finance is skewed, it's biased, it reflects global northern priorities. What, top 3 things as we come to finish, what are the top 3 things that you would do to the Climate Finance Fund to change things that would be game changers, literally?
I think it's getting money to where it hasn't reached so far. So it's making access easier. There's countries, a very good example of the GCF, there's countries that GCF has been in operation for about 6 years now. It was operationalized in 2015. So that's about 6 years. There's countries that have not received adaptation finance. By 2020, there was a report that was done then that found that countries have not received a cent for adaptation finance. That means that access for them is really, really challenging. And so for countries like Kenya, and I'm Kenyan and I admit this, Kenya is a donor favorite. For countries like Kenya, they'll apply for funding. It will be comparatively easier for them than other countries such as Somalia or Sudan or South Sudan, or even Sudan itself. And so we need to kind of use an equitable approach to make sure that there's access. And access, at the center of access, is capacity to, improving the capacity of institutions to create a pipeline of projects, but also to manage this pipeline of projects that contribute towards meaningful climate action. And that's not it. I mean, there's much more to that, but yeah, that's kind of a very good start for that.
Great. Well, Jessica, I could ask you lots more questions. There are more questions, and I'm sorry to those people who I didn't get to your questions. Next week, we have Jay Pitter talking about resisting the invisible woman syndrome. But can we give a warm UEP, shareable, Kresge Foundation thank you to Jessica Omukuti, Oxford University. Thank you, Jessica. And we'll see you next week.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.